a left marker out, so let's do that. But in this particular lecture, we'll talk about what is an ecosystem structure, just like the last one we did. What is an ecosystem structure and its dynamics? What caused it to change? So that's what we're looking at over the whole course of this thing. What is the ecosystem structure and how does it change? That's all a dynamic means. Okay, so an ecosystem we would define as all the organisms in a community and then their abiotic environment as well. Okay, so the ecosystem is the organisms and then the abiotic factors. So in an ecosystem, we'll have energy flow and we'll have chemical flow, or chemical cycling rather. But energy flow will move through the components of an ecosystem, and chemical cycling is the transfer of materials within the ecosystem. So energy flow is sort of unidirectional, it only goes one way, whereas chemical cycling will kind of be recycled in the environment and then be moved around through it. So that's the difference there. A terrarium is a really wonderful representation of an ecosystem, and it illustrates the fundamentals of energy flow. I don't know, I've actually got a really good picture for this. I'll show it to you later, but it's cool stuff. So energy flow is like light energy comes into this. It grows our little plant that we have here, and then we've got like the snail that's going to eat part of the plant, and it will take the energy from the sun, from the plant, into the little caterpillar. Oh, sorry, I wanted to say caterpillar, into the snail. And then some will lose its heat energy. So energy will only flow this direction and then back out. That's it. However, chemicals will go through the whole thing. So if we're talking about like carbon, we'll have sugars being made here that go into this little guy. Eventually the carbon comes out and maybe it's poop. And then these guys will utilize the carbon in a different way. And then it gets moved up because as both of these things release CO2 because they're animals, they'll get released in this tank again, which will then get used by the plant to make sugars. And so we're going to recycle all those nutrients. Okay. So cycle versus the sort of flow on that one. The amount of solar energy converted to chemical energy in organic compounds. So organic, remember, contains carbon. By an ecosystem's producer for a given area and during a given time is called primary production. Okay, so solar energy converted to chemical energy, and just for carbon compounds. Ecologists call this amount or mass of living organic material in an ecosystem biomass. Just means sort of the mass of life. Not very creative. Different ecosystems vary in their primary production and their contribution of total production to the biosphere. You can imagine what areas probably have the most biomass. So if we look at net primary production, thinking about these things, like the tropical rainforest is going to have a massive amount. Desert and tundra are pretty neck and neck in the fact that not a whole lot's happening. And believe it or not, in the open ocean, there's not a ton happening. But in algal beds, coral reefs, and estuaries, you actually get a ton of stuff. And in fact, for net productivity, coral reefs and algal beds actually surpass tropical rainforests, which we don't always think of, which is interesting. There's some cool things to think about. So a caterpillar represents our primary consumer. We learned that in our last lecture, is that a caterpillar eating on whatever kind of plant it is gives us our primary consumer. Of the organic compounds a caterpillar ingests, 50% is eliminated as feces. So it's going to eat all that stuff and lose half of it as poop. 35% of it is used for cellular respiration, and then 15% is converted to the caterpillar's biomass. So 15% of it is getting used to make that caterpillar get bigger. Only about a third of it is actually used for cellular respiration, which, remember, we're taking in sugar and we're producing CO2 from it. But we're also getting energy. Remember, there's some other stuff there, but the sugar has the carbon, so I'm trying to follow the carbon here. That's our carbon-to-carbon situation, and that's what actually produces energy. So we can only use like a third of the stuff that it eats to actually obtain energy. And that kind of feels like a waste, but that's how that works. There's just some inefficient bits to it. So again, a caterpillar is eating, this is a little hornworm, he's eating this plant, he will lose a bunch of energy, it's poop, he'll use about 15% of it for growth, and then 35% for energy to move and eat more, because that's all they do, is they just eat poop. I'm not making that up. That's all caterpillars, just watch them. That's all they do. Spend their entire baby life eating and pooping. Alright, like toddlers, eating and pooping. Alright? So a pyramid of production illustrates the cumulative loss of energy with each transfer in the food chain. So this part is really important, and I've seen them also put this on the STAR test several times. But only about 10% of the energy stored at each trophic level or nutrient level is available for the next level. So the efficiencies of energy transfer usually range from 5 to 20%. So this is key. As you move up the trophic level, there's not that much available. So producers get the most because they get 10% of that sort of sunlight energy, if you will. They can sort of utilize 10,000 kilocalories. 10% of that is only 1,000, so this primary consumer that eats that plant is getting 1,000 calories of sort of nutrients from that. By the time you move up to secondary consumers, only 100, and only 10 is utilized by the tertiary consumers. I mean, in my opinion, if you look at it, and I do tend to eat meat, and more than I would like to even, but it does kind of say something about the efficiency of energy if we were to be more vegetarian. Just something to think about, a little food for thought on that one. Pun intended. So an important implication of the stepwise decline of energy in each trophic structure is that the amount of energy available of top-level consumers is small compared to that of the available of low-level consumers. Only a tiny fraction of the energy stored by photosynthesis flows through a food chain all the way to the tertiary consumer. So it explains why top-level consumers, such as lions and hawks, require so much geographic territory. You've got to get a lot to be able to capture that energy of the sun. As omnivores, people eat plant material and meat. So when humans eat grain or fruit, we're primary consumers. When we eat beef and other meats from herbivores, we're secondary. If you eat fish like trout or salmon, you're a tertiary or quaternary consumer. I've definitely eaten all of those. Okay, only about 10% of the chemical energy available at each trophic level is passed to the next higher trophic level. So again, reiterating a point there. So the human population has to eat about 10 times more energy available to it when people eat plants than when they eat the meat of herbivores. Okay, so a little bit makes more sense. The other thing about it is eating meat is actually kind of expensive, both economically and environmentally. So there's some comments on sustainability, just some things to think about. The more we eat of, more we eat of vegetables, the more we're actually able to use that energy. There's less we're able to eat if we use, if we're eating beef. So it's interesting. You get less actual energy out of some of that stuff, and it's less efficient, and economically, environmentally, it's just not all that great. So ecosystems are supplied with a continual influx of energy from the sun and the Earth's interior. Except for meteorites, there are no real extraterrestrial sources of chemical elements. So life also depends on recycling of chemicals. We've got to reuse some. Energy flow happens unidirectionally, but this one's going to be recycled. So lots of fun words. Biogeochemical cycles. Bio is life. Geo is earth. Chemicals are chemicals. So these are life, earth, chemical cycles. And when you see them, they include life and earth and chemicals. So they include some biotic components, some abiotic components, maybe some abiotic reservoirs. These are where chemicals accumulate or are stockpiled outside of living organisms. Biogeochemical cycles can be local or global. Just depends on how you're working. All right, so nutrients available for the producers. It goes to the producers. It can go out several different ways to either decomposers or the consumers. and then it'll wrap all back around to an abiotic reservoir, which will keep it going until it's needed again at any point in the cycle. It's sort of what that's showing. I think it's kind of a terrible graphic. Anywho, one of those examples of a major thing that we need is carbon. By the way, we're at that 10-minute mark, so this is a good place to stop and take a break if you need to take one. Jot your questions out to the side, come on back. So carbon is the major ingredient of all organic molecules found in the atmosphere and in fossil fuels, and dissolved in carbon compounds in the ocean. So the reciprocal metabolic processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are mainly responsible for the cycling of carbon between the abiotic and biotic worlds. So if you kind of need a review on that one, is that we've got CO2 that we exhale, but plants are able to use that CO2 in photosynthesis to produce sugars. The sugars, which is C6H12O6, you need to remember that. That's where our carbon's coming from. We as consumers will then eat that, respire, and go back out into the environment and then back around. So this is sort of that kind of photosynthesis, kind of cellular respiration cycle that we talked about. But we do have other components. So some of these things will die and be detritus, and so some things will decompose it, or detritivores may even eat it, but we're going to get some cycling there and decomposition, and it may go into the atmosphere. We also get burning of fossil fuels that contributes to CO2 in the atmosphere, other than just being able to breathe it out. So this is sort of that main part of it, but then you've got some additional parts that actually include the earth, the geo part of this stuff, where you've got detritus and then moving up into the atmosphere. On a global scale, the return of CO2 to the atmosphere by cellular respiration closely balances its removal by photosynthesis, but the increased burning of wood and fossil fuels is raising the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's maybe not quite balancing out, especially as we continue sort of deforestation and taking some of those things out. Organisms that require phosphorus, usually in the form of a phosphate ion, PO4 3-, for nucleic acids, phospholipids, ATP, and mineral components of bones and teeth, phosphorus is important, and we usually find it in that phosphate ion. In contrast to the carbon cycle, however, the other biogeochemical cycles, the phosphorus cycle does not have an atmospheric component, so there's no atmosphere involved here. So rocks are the only source of phosphorus in terrestrial ecosystems. Plants will absorb phosphate ions in the soil and build them into organic compounds. Phosphates are returned to the soil by decomposers. Phosphate levels in the aquatic ecosystem are typically low enough to be a limiting factor, so it's not that big of a deal. So really, again, no atmospheric component up top, but it's just from rock, maybe lifting up, weathering. We'll get into plants that way. Phosphates in soil would be picked up by plants, eaten by animals, and then again, detritus and decomposers break it back down so it can be used in water, it can be in rock, and then it can kind of all go through. The big thing there is that we can only really get it from the rock, so no atmosphere on that one. So I'd make that key, is that there is no atmospheric component. Okay. All right. Some of these are a little hard to look at. You may have to take a second to follow it. I'm just trying to keep yours a little shorter this time since I went long last time. So because phosphates are transferred from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems much more rapidly than they are replaced, the amount in terrestrial ecosystem gradually diminishes over time. So as we have soil erosion from the land cleared for agricultural development, it accelerates the loss of phosphates. Farmers and gardeners often use crushed phosphate rock, bone meal, finely ground bones from slaughtered livestock, that's terrible, guano, bat poop, and droppings from seabirds and bats to add phosphorus to the soil. So again, we're having to replenish it by some different means. The next one's nitrogen. So the nitrogen is an ingredient of proteins and nucleic acids. It's essential to the structure and functioning of all organisms, and it's crucial and often limited in plant nutrients. So nitrogen has two abiotic reservoirs, the atmosphere and the soil. So in the atmosphere, about 80% of it is nitrogen gas. Here's the thing, though. That 80% that's nitrogen gas is not usable, so we need some nitrogen fixation. It converts into to compounds of nitrogen that actually can be used by plants, and it's carried out by some bacteria. But that's the thing, is the N2 in the environment isn't actually useful at all. We can't do anything with it. You can breathe it in, you breathe it right back out. Like, what are you going to do with it? So we need some fixing of it so we can use it. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but if we have N2 in the atmosphere, it may go down into the soil because we'll have some nitrogen fixing bacteria that can actually take it and convert it to something the plant would use. There's some other bacteria that's on its own that can fix it into ammonia. Ammonia will also come from as sort of organic stuff from other animals will excrete ammonia instead of like urea as far as urine goes. Urine's got our kind of nitrogenous waste in it. But we've got these decomposers. All of it will mainly give us ammonia in the soil. We might have a nitrifying bacteria that will take the ammonium and make it into a nitrate so it can be used for plants as well. The ammonium might be used for plants too. Denitrifiers can actually put it back into the atmosphere if needed, but there's a lot of little bacteria here that make the nitrogen useful at several different levels, and that's the key to this kind of diagram, is that we've got lots of fixers here and sort of some changers that can make the nitrogen into something we can utilize. Last thing, human activities, as far as this goes, are disrupting the nitrogen cycle by adding more nitrogen to the biosphere each year than natural processes. So combustion of fossil fuels in motor vehicles and coal-powered plants produces nitrogen oxides, NO and NO2. Modern agriculture is another major source of nitrogen, and some nitrogen escapes the atmosphere where it forms NO2 or nitrous oxide N2O, which is an inert gas that lingers in the atmosphere and contributes to global warming. So we're adding more nitrogen. Even adding more fertilizers and things like that are contributing to more nitrogen in soil. In aquatic ecosystems, primary production is limited to low nutrient levels of phosphorus and nitrogen. So over time, standing water ecosystems gradually accumulate the nutrients from decomposition or other organic matter and fresh influx from the land. The primary production increases in a process known as eutrophication. So eutrophication is kind of this influx of phosphorus and nitrogen. So we get this increase of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment that doesn't normally have it. So eutrophication in lakes, rivers, and coastal waters depletes the oxygen levels and decreases species diversity. And that's the thing that's the biggest bummer, is that we really need to keep species diversity so we have a healthy environment. In many areas, phosphate pollution leads to eutrophication, and it comes from agricultural fertilizers, just as I was talking about, pesticides, sewage treatment facilities, and runoff from animal waste and feedlots. So lots of areas where we end up getting some extra nitrogen or phosphorus that leads to stuff that we don't necessarily want. We can look at that one a little bit later, but this is sort of an area that had an influx of those nutrients, and so it caused the algae to grow better because it then has the nutrient that it normally is limited to, so it can continue to grow. Nitrogen runoff from Midwestern farm fields has been linked to a dead zone observed each summer in Gulf of Mexico. Vast algal blooms extend outward from where the Mississippi River deposits nutrient-laden waters. As the algae die, decomposition of huge quantities of biomass diminishes the supply of dissolved oxygen over an area from about 13,000 to 22,000 kilometers squared, and roughly 5,000 to 8,500 square miles. So a huge area because of these algal blooms, and they're sort of, imminent death afterwards. So you can see what's happening in this. In the wintertime, it's not as bad, and then there's a larger growth of this stuff over the summer. Tremendous. So humans rely upon natural ecosystems to supply fresh water and some foods, recycle nutrients, decompose waste, and regulate climate and air quality. So we need this. Wetlands, here's a little bit about them, will actually buffer coastal populations against tidal waves and hurricanes. They reduce the impact of flooding rivers and filter pollution. So thoughts here, flooding rivers, stuff like that. We've seen a lot of that issue even in our own area. So that might be a thing to think of. If you stay in the community and you're here and you get educated and you're down for all the science stuff, think about wetlands. How do you apply a wetland to this area? How do you conserve a wetland? How do we keep those things so we have it so it minimizes flooding in other regions where it might be important? So there's a good application of our whole ecosystem and all the stuff that we're talking about and how we actually might be able to utilize it for our own community. Natural vegetation helps to retain fertile soil and prevent landslides and mudslides. That's less here do we see the landslides and mudslides, but there are plenty of places where they'll want to. All right. Ecosystems that we create are also essential for our well-being. Agricultural ecosystems supply so much of our food and our fibers. You're like, food and fibers, what are you talking about? Food is basic food and fibers clothing. So think cotton for clothing. You get that one? My dog's coming to visit, by the way. We're at the end of these lectures and she's coming to visit. Come on, you got this. She's really struggling. So make use of ecosystem services such as control of agricultural pests by natural predators and pollination of crops. They rely on nutrient cycling and maintain soil fertility, the foundation for crop growth. Oh, there's a good one. Since she's come in here, she wants to bother me. That sounds like a good time for an Easter egg. She's their Easter egg inspiration. So including my doggie, you can either do energy flow or nutrient cycling, but remember this is a Great Dane mix, so we call her Charlie, we call her the horse, Charlie Horse. So I need to see either one, so you can do whatever nutrient cycling you want, and you can go back, whichever one you want, or do energy flow, but Charlie Horse must be included in this diagram. You can either draw her or put her name in there, but I need to see Charlie Horse, and I need to see her represented as either energy flow or nutrient recycling. How about it? Or chemical cycling, if we want to go with the terminology in here. There you go. Since you came in here and bothered me, now you're an inspiration for Easter eggs. She's looking away. She'll be excited when she sees the result. So agricultural methods introduced over the past several decades have pushed croplands beyond their natural capacity to produce food. So nutrient runoff affects freshwater and marine ecosystems as fertilizer use increases. This is the tricky bit about fertilizer. Pesticides actually can kill beneficial organisms as well as pests. So we've got, talking about pests and overrun of things, is that there's maybe too many of the, Asian lady beetle, and it's the ladybug that you probably see everywhere. It becomes sort of a pest, but it's a natural predator. So are praying mantises, and so are a few other things, your assassin bugs. And sometimes the pesticides can kill those guys, even though they're doing a pretty good job killing your bugs for you already. Clearing and cultivating actually expose land to wind and water that erode the rich topsoil. In China, for example, overgrazing and other poor agricultural practices turned a 900 square miles of land, so about the size of Rhode Island, into a desert each year. It's like the sad part of this whole lecture. So then they have these sort of sandstorms and windstorms that happen, and it's kind of sucks. Human activities also threaten many forest ecosystems and the services they provide. So forests are also cut down to provide timber and fuel wood. Many people in non-industrialized countries use wood for heating and cooking, which we need this part because I don't think that this is quite that bad, but just, cutting forests down to provide timber is kind of tricky. Okay. So on a small scale, I'm not sure that it's that big of a deal, but as we move into the larger scale, it does become a big deal. So the growing demand for human population for food, fibers, and water has largely been satisfied at the expense of other ecosystem services, but these practices cannot continue indefinitely. So sustainability is kind of the goal of developing and managing and conserving Earth's resources in ways that meet needs of people today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. So we want to sustain the stuff that we have. We want to keep it. We want to use it, but then be able to keep it so your generation and your baby's generation, baby's baby's generation will still have stuff. See that? Oh, okay. We got to the end. All right. I'll put that up for you a little bit later, too, because it does serve as a nice review at the end of the chapter, and now that we've finished chapter 37. But that is essentially the end of this whole business. So we may have a little bit more to go, but that's the end of chapter 37, and we've moved up to the ecosystems. So if you have any questions at all about the stuff, shoot me an email, and we'll get it figured out.